Record.
Hey
Double
folks,
tap mic trigger.
as I record this, I'm actually in bed.
Mic trigger. Messages. Now. Finish record. Mic lock. Button. Is on. Double tap.
But I thought, I'm in bed now, so I just thought, screw this, I'll do this video and then I'll just go to sleep, because anyway. So I'm going to do a top 6 of my favourite albums, really good albums, because we did top terrible albums last time. You know, bear in mind, you might not like any of these albums on the list. So, without further ado, bear in mind these are all the albums that I bought. Even the ones on iTunes. So, there are a couple. So, this is actually a top 7, because there is a couple on iTunes which I went and bought and loved. And to be honest, you know, these are worth your money. And in fact, if you are planning to buy an album, or if you're planning to give these a first listen, then these are definitely worth a listen as well. So, at number 7 is Jethro Tull's Songs from the Wood. Now, technically, I wouldn't give this a first, this is probably not an album I'd recommend. However, this is a really good album from Jethro Tull. It's, you know, it's before they gave us the rubbish albums. You know, those 2 rubbish albums, after this. Actually, no, there was a really good album after this, because we had Broadsword and the Beast, which is a really good album. So, anyway, yeah, it's one of my favourite albums, and it was the first album I ever bought from Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson. And it's got that amazing Christmas song on it. So, yeah, Songs from the Wood at number 7. It's not the most memorable album, but I'd actually just, before I bought the album, I went to see Jethro Tull. So, and when you see them live, you know, you got to remember that Songs from the Wood's not got all their anthems on it. The first 2 albums have got all their anthems on. So, yeah. So, in at number 6 is Rage Against the Machine's second album, because Renegades was the first album they did. And bear in mind, right, this was produced by Rick Rubin. But this is a real dead good album. Now, Rage may have held back with some of the things, but with everything else, it was like a real tight production. You know. And again, this is the first album I heard that Rage Against the Machine ever did. And you know, they went on to do better things. You know, but I would have liked to have seen Rage Against the Machine do something like a concept album or something, but I don't know. I don't know what. Probably see something more in the future. There is a future for the band, I think. Well, I hope. But yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? So in at number 5, I'm gonna stick in do you know what? I'm gonna stick in a Cradle of Filth album in, because it's on my difficult albums list. This album would have been on my difficult albums list, but unfortunately it's going to be on my best albums list, and that's Dusk and Embrace. Now, unfortunately, I did own it, but I lost it. Now, what I liked about this album, the production on it is fantastic. They cleaned it up a little bit because it was a demo tape originally, and it got re-released. And it's just a brilliant album because it got re-released. I can't remember why the release was held from it, but yeah, it was recorded, and unfortunately when you hear it, it doesn't sound like it was recorded back in the 90s. It was recorded in 92 or 93 or something like that. But yeah, it was way back when, you know, and there are still new turning points on this album. You know, and they had a really good bass player on Dusk and Embrace too. Now, the drummer left midway through, but then came back on their following album, so they didn't stick with the same drummer on this album. And also, I think this is rumoured that Danny Filth tried to produce most of it. But it was a difficult album because, again, on the management's terms, I mean, it was held for release for a while, but it's like fresh out the studio. And the artwork is pretty decent on the album too. So yeah, that's in at number 5. In at number 4 is The Who's Who Are You? Again, could have been a difficult... Well, it was a difficult album because Keith Moon was literally drunk on every track. And the band were just literally up and down. However, it's a very tight album. Like, this is when the Who were starting to do very tight productions. It wasn't like they hadn't before, but it was like a very tight album for them, I think. As a listener, I think you could tell it was more sort of tighter. There was no sort of rough around the edges type work from, you know, it just, there wasn't that sort of stuff. It was more kind of, you know, tighter playing, which is I guess what you need from the band, I guess. In number 3 is the Prodigy's Music for the Jilted Generation. Now, this album was the album that I heard second. I heard Fat of the Land first, but I must say that Music for the Jilted Generation was a much better album, because it had, like, this was an album that was like, it was the Prodigy's second album, but it was their first tight album that they did, because their second tight album was very tight on production, which was Fat of the Land. However, Music for the Jilted Generation still had that. It was like rave was still around as people knew it. People were still making Toy Town techno albums. But there was other stuff around. It's just, it wasn't being played on the radio. And then this album came, and it was just like, it was what people needed to hear. There was lots of other sounds on it. It was way ahead of Toy Town techno. It was, I mean, everything the Prodigy did was way ahead of its time, even when they were doing their early stuff. Even when, because, you know, yeah, the Prodigy could write a cheesy rave song and still yet have that heavy bass lines and stuff like that. You got to remember that the Prodigy were listening to a lot of stuff, you know, realizing that they could do it, they could get away with it. You know, and I think also what I liked about Music for the Jilted Generation is the attitude behind it. Was just, there was a lot of attitude behind that album, especially from Liam Howell at the time. You know, and there was no holding back when that album was done. So, yeah, lot to be said for that album, really. So these top 2 albums, the next band on my list, revived Prodigy, and that's Pendulum. And their first album was just an amazing. There was no disappointments to it. It was, strange enough, it was the last Pendulum album I ever bought. So it was, you know, to hear all those tunes first, and Pendulum's like, when you hear their first album, the drum sounds weren't fat. You know, they weren't too fat. They weren't sort of too, you know, that's how we like Pendulum with their fat drum sounds. But they were more kind of, you know, the punchy snares on that. I think what we heard was kind of, you know, all the over-compressed tracks and that came towards the end of the album, you know, on stuff like Blood Sugar, and I think you know that this was an album that hit people really, really hard. I think you know, this was you know, the album sort of opened up with this concept of what it was, of this journey of what drum and bass should be. And my word. Now, I've got an honourable mention before we get to our number one. And an honourable mention is Ronnie Size's New Forms. I think the production on, you know, just kind of trying to do jazz samples, and I think there was a bit more to it. There was elements of funk and all this kind of stuff, and it was a difficult time for Ronnie Size. Now, reading all the interviews about Ronnie Size, and of course hearing you know, the next album, which he did, you know, which it's great, but I prefer the album that he did after. I think the thing is as well, you've got to admit that Ronnie Size did do a fantastic EP which came after New Forms, and I think, you know, these are things like these artists just blew people away. And in at number one is Death Grips, The Money Store. Now, I've said this countless times again, that the Death Grips album just, you know, I had been looking for an experimental artist, and like back in 2010, there was a lot of experimental bands out there, but nothing like Death Grips. I think this was a band that came and went. And I think to hear more from this band, you'd have to follow them and be an iconic follower more than a, you know, you could just be a fan of this band, because this album had you hooked but wanting more. You know, to call Death Grips a hip-hop band is an understatement. To call Death Grips a techno band is an understatement. To call anything of that, it's Death Grips didn't want to pin themselves to a genre. Hence why all their tracks have all these different sounds, take you to all these different places. And it's not till we got to, say, No Love, Deep Web, where everything became more alienated and isolated. But this was really what it was all about. And I think The Money Store is a great listen. And the production on that album is fantastic. And, you know, you just know these guys ain't gonna disappoint you anytime soon. Anyway, that is it for this list. But you just know that, you know, like I said, now I'm doing a Creative Thoughts video pretty soon. It's about stuff that I want to talk about. I'm doing a vlogcast pretty soon too. But I just thought I'd give you this. And remember, you people might not like any of these albums on this list. You might have a couple of albums that you like. But these are the albums that I enjoy the most.
Mic trigger. Mic lock. Finish recording.